Hey everyone, before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's what tells YouTube to keep bringing you stories like this one. All right, let's get into it. The rust on that mile marker wasn't from weather. I know that now. Weather doesn't rust metal in circles, layer over layer, like something's been welding it back together for 40 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've been driving mountain freight for 11 years, and in that time, I picked up exactly one rule from the old-timers that I never broke. Don't touch the radio dial above Channel 19 after dark on Ashford Pass. Nobody ever told me why. They just said it the way you'd tell someone not to walk under a ladder. Half joke, half warning, and I filed it away. The same way you file away things you don't actually believe. That rule had never mattered to me. Not until the night my CB started picking up static exactly 4 miles past the Ashford Way station. I was hauling 18 tons of steel coil that night, taking the grade in low gear with the engine brake growling under me. Fog so thick my high beams just bounced it back into my own eyes. I'd already resigned myself to a slow crawl the rest of the way to the depot. Then the static started and it had a rhythm to it, a pulse, like breathing. And underneath it, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, a voice reading off numbers. I should have kept driving. I knew that even as I reached for the dial. The frequency sat in a gap between 2 licensed channels, a gap that, according to every manual I'd ever read, shouldn't carry a signal at all. But there it was, clear as anything once I tuned in. A man's voice reading coordinates in a flat, unhurried cadence, or mile markers, or something I didn't have a name for. I checked my dash clock, 2:17 in the morning, alone on a road that wouldn't see another vehicle for the better part of an hour, hauling a load due in Charleston by 6, listening to a voice that had no business being on my radio at all. The numbers stopped. A pause. Then a sentence that wasn't numbers. You're 11 minutes from the marker. My hand froze on the dial. I hadn't given a location. I hadn't keyed my mic once. And that voice spoke like it already knew exactly where I was on that mountain, exactly how far I had left, exactly what was waiting for me at the end of it. I checked my mirrors, empty road, fog swallowing whatever might have been behind me. I checked my GPS. 11 minutes to the next mile marker. Just a green sign bolted to a guardrail somewhere ahead in the dark. That's all it should have been. The static thickened, and underneath the man's voice, I started hearing something else. A second layer, indistinct, overlapping, like a recording playing inside another recording. I turned the volume down without deciding to. Some part of my brain just didn't want it clearer. I thought about pulling over. I actually eased off the gas, seriously considered it, but something about the fog and the empty road and those 11 minutes ticking down made stopping feel worse than continuing. Whatever was on that frequency already knew where I was. Sitting still wasn't going to change that. The marker, when I reached it, wasn't what I expected. It stood at a pull-off. I didn't remember from any run I'd made through Ashford Pass, and I've made that run more times than I can count. The number matched my GPS exactly, but the post itself was wrong. Rusted through in rings, welded and re-welded so many times that any DOT crew would have just replaced the whole thing years ago instead of patching it. My radio, still tuned to that frequency, went silent. Not static silent, the kind of silent that makes your own ears ring. I kept driving. past the marker, past the pull-off, watching it shrink in my mirror until the fog took it. I didn't touch that dial again for the rest of the drive. At the depot in Charleston just before 6, I mentioned it to another driver over coffee, expecting him to laugh. He didn't. He set his cup down slow and asked me one question. "Did it use your name?" I said no. It had only talked about the marker, the minutes remaining, nothing personal. He nodded like that answer meant something specific he wasn't going to explain, and no amount of pushing got another word out of him. I still run Ashford Pass twice a month. I still keep that dial tuned above channel 19 when the fog rolls in, though I'm not sure anymore if that's caution or something closer to wanting it to happen again. I haven't heard the frequency since, but I keep a note in my glove box with that mile marker written on it just in case. I've never told anyone what I plan to do with it if the static ever finds me twice. I've hauled freight through a lot of mountain checkpoints, but only one of them has ever waved me in, logged my weight, stamped my paperwork, and then vanished off every record that's supposed to prove it exists. My name's Nathan Kessler, and I run the Route 9 grade through the Blue Ridge Corridor twice a week, mostly refrigerated loads, produce and dairy. The kind of freight that doesn't wait for you to figure out what's wrong before it spoils. That night, I was hauling a full trailer of dairy out of a co-op in Tennessee, bound for a distribution center 2 states over, running tight on my delivery window because a tire blowout outside Knoxville had eaten 2 hours I didn't have to spare. I was pushing hard up the grade when the lights came into view. A way station, sitting exactly where I didn't expect one, on a stretch of mountain highway I'd driven probably 200 times without ever seeing so much as a pull-off. Floodlights bright enough to sting my eyes after an hour of darkness. A uniformed officer waving me toward the scale with the kind of bored, practiced motion that told me this was routine to him. Even if it wasn't routine to me, I pulled in because you don't argue with a wave-in. You just don't. He checked my logbook against my hours of service, checked my bill of lading, asked the standard questions about my load and my rest breaks, and the whole exchange felt so ordinary that I stopped questioning why I'd never seen this station before. Maybe I'd just never noticed it. Maybe I'd always passed through during daylight when the floodlights weren't needed. I told myself things like that because they were easier than the alternative. He handed my paperwork back stamped, told me I was clear to go, and I pulled back onto the highway without thinking twice. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when my dispatcher called asking why my hours of service log showed a stop at a way station that, according to her, did not exist. I told her she was wrong. I'd been there. I had the stamp on my paperwork to prove it, and I said as much, pulling the log up while I was still on the phone with her, ready to read her the station's ID number off the page. There wasn't one. The stamp was there. I could see it, a circular imprint with the state seal, official as anything I'd ever had pressed onto my paperwork in 11 years of driving. But where the station's identification number should have been printed inside that seal, there was nothing. Just blank space, like the stamp itself had never carried a number to begin with. My dispatcher told me she'd checked the state DOT registry for every way station on that stretch of highway, going back decades, and none of them matched the mile marker I'd given her. The closest station was 11 miles further up the grade. Nothing existed at the location I'd stopped. I told her I'd driven Route 9 for years. I told her I knew that grade well enough to notice a new structure going up, even one built quickly, even one built quietly, She didn't argue with me. She just asked in a voice that had gone carefully flat whether the officer who'd checked my logbook had said anything else. Anything unusual. I hadn't thought about it until she asked. But there had been one thing. Before he waved me through, he'd looked at my bill of lading a second time, longer than the first, and asked me a question that hadn't made sense to me then and made even less sense to me now. "How many times have you made this run?" I'd told him. "More times than I could count," I'd said, and he'd nodded like that was the answer he expected and handed my paperwork back. My dispatcher went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she told me, carefully, that I should keep the stamped paperwork. Not file it, not turn it in with the rest of my logs. Just keep it somewhere safe in case anyone from the company ever asked to see it. I still have it. I keep it folded in the visor of my truck, and I've driven that same stretch of Route 9 more times since then than I can count. Always slower now, always watching the tree line for floodlights that have never come back. The mile marker where I stopped that night has nothing on it now. No station, no pull-off, not even a gap in the guardrail wide enough for a truck to pull through. I've asked other drivers on that route if they've ever been waved into a station past the Tennessee line, somewhere before the 11-mile marker. Most say no. One driver, an older man who's run that grade longer than I've been alive, didn't answer right away. He just asked if the officer had asked me how many times I'd made the run. I said yes. He told me that was the only question that mattered, and he wouldn't say another word about it after that, no matter how many times I asked. I've used a runaway truck ramp exactly once in my career, and I've spent every day since wishing I'd never needed to. My name's Ray Corbin, and I've hauled heavy freight through the Appalachians for almost 15 years. Most drivers who run mountain grades long enough eventually have one bad night, the kind where the brakes start smelling wrong on a descent, and every instinct in your body goes cold at once. Mine happened on a stretch of grade in the Virginia Highlands, hauling a fully loaded flatbed of construction steel on a night with just enough rain to make everything worse. I felt the brake pedal go soft about halfway down the mountain. Not gone, not yet, but soft, in a way that told me exactly what was coming if I didn't do something in the next 30 seconds. 18 wheels and 40 tons don't forgive hesitation on a 6% grade, and I'd trained for this moment more times in my head than I ever wanted to use it for real. I downshifted hard, felt the engine brake fight the weight, and started scanning the shoulder for the sign I already knew was coming up, because every driver memorizes where the runaway ramps are on a route like this. You have to. The ramp appeared in my headlights right where it should have been, a long bed of gravel angled up into the dark, built exactly for nights like this one. I took it without slowing to think about it, felt the truck buck hard as the wheels hit the loose surface, felt the gravel finally doing its job and dragging my speed down until the cab lurched to a stop with a violence that rattled every bone in my body. I sat there for a long moment just breathing, hands still locked on the wheel before I noticed the tracks. They were already there, gouged deep into the gravel bed ahead of my own tire marks, cutting the same path up the ramp that I'd just carved myself, except older weathered, half filled in by rain that had fallen long before tonight's storm. Someone else had used this ramp before me. That wasn't strange on its own. That's what the ramp was for. What was strange was the tire pattern. I've spent 15 years around freight equipment, and I know tire tread when I see it. These tracks weren't from anything modern. The width was wrong, narrower than any tire rated for the kind of load that needs a runaway ramp today. And the tread pattern matched something I'd only ever seen in old photographs my father kept from his own driving days. Rigs that hadn't been manufactured since before I was born. I got out of my cab to look closer. Rain still coming down light and cold, and the tracks held their shape even as water pooled in the grooves. Fresh enough that the gravel hadn't settled back into place around the edges. Old enough that the tread pattern shouldn't have existed on any truck currently licensed to drive American highways. I followed them with my flashlight, up past where my own truck had stopped, further up the ramp than my dead momentum had carried me. The tracks kept going, climbing higher than any runaway ramp I'd ever seen built, curving up into darkness my flashlight couldn't reach the end of. I didn't follow them any further than that. I called it in instead, told dispatch I'd use the ramp, needed a tow to get my rig back onto the grade, and said nothing about the tracks because I didn't have words yet for what I was looking at. The tow truck driver, who arrived an hour later, walked the ramp with me while we waited for the recovery crew, and I asked him carefully if he'd ever heard of a rig using this ramp before, one old enough to explain the tread pattern I was seeing. He looked at the tracks for a long time before he answered. Then he told me that ramp had been rebuilt twice in the years he'd worked this stretch, after 2 separate accidents that never made it into any public report he'd ever seen filed. He wouldn't say more than that, and when I pushed, he just said some ramps on this route had a way of catching more than they were built to catch, and left it there. I've never used that ramp again. I've had 2 more close calls on other grades since that night, and both times I picked a different way to slow down, even a worse one, rather than take that particular stretch of gravel a second time. I still don't know whose tracks those were, or how something like that pattern ended up fresh in gravel that gets graded and replaced every few years by state maintenance crews who've never once mentioned finding anything unusual. I asked one of those maintenance crews about it directly a few months later at a rest stop where I recognized their county truck. The man I spoke to went quiet in a way I recognized by then, the same quiet I'd seen from the tow driver, and told me only that they replace the gravel on that ramp more often than any other one on the route, and that they don't ask why it needs it. I've hauled freight in and out of Appalachian distribution yards for almost 9 years, and in that time, I learned to trust exactly 2 numbers on every run: what my load weighed going out, and what it weighed coming back empty. Those numbers don't lie, except once. My name's Colin Ashby, and I run a regular circuit hauling bottled goods out of a bottling plant in eastern Kentucky, up through the mountain corridor into Ohio, empty trailer back the same night. It's routine work, the kind you stop thinking about after the first year, which is probably why I noticed immediately when something about it stopped being routine. I dropped my load at the distribution center just after midnight, watched the forklift crew clear my trailer completely, walked the empty bed myself, the way I always do, before heading back, out of habit more than necessity. Nothing back there. Bare aluminum floor, a few tie-down straps. Nothing else. I climbed back into my cab and started the return run through the mountains, empty trailer riding light behind me the way it always does after a drop. Except it didn't ride light. Not the way it should have. I felt it on the first grade. A heaviness in the trailer's sway that didn't match an empty load. The kind of resistance you only get from weight you're not supposed to be carrying. I told myself it was wind or a mechanical issue. Something explainable. I've driven empty trailers through mountain crosswinds enough times to know what that feels like, and this wasn't that. This felt like cargo. I pulled into a rest area about 40 minutes into the return trip, climbed out, walked back to check the trailer doors, told myself I'd find them exactly as I'd left them. They were. Sealed shut, my own lock still in place, no sign of tampering. I opened them anyway, empty. Bare aluminum floor, same as when I'd left the distribution center. Nothing to explain the weight I'd felt on that grade. I climbed back into my cab and kept driving, chalking it up to exhaustion. A long shift, finally catching up with my senses. But 3 miles later, on the next grade, the same heaviness returned. Worse this time, enough that I actually checked my mirrors to see if my trailer doors had somehow come open, spilling ghost cargo I couldn't account for. They hadn't. Everything sat sealed and secure exactly as it should. I called it in to dispatch, more to have someone else on the line than because I expected an answer, and mentioned the weight discrepancy almost as an afterthought. Embarrassed, even as I said it. My dispatcher went quiet for a moment, then asked which grade I was on. I told her. She asked if I was near a specific mile marker, one I didn't recognize by number, but recognized by location once she described it. A stretch of road locals called Widow's Grade, for reasons nobody had ever explained to me. She told me other drivers had reported the exact same thing on that stretch. Always empty trailers, always after a drop, always the same 2 grades where the weight seemed to return from nowhere and then vanish again once you cleared the ridge. Nobody had ever found anything in their trailers. Nobody had ever explained where the weight came from or where it went. I asked her why nobody had ever flagged this before, why it wasn't in any driver safety bulletin, any route warning. She said something I haven't been able to shake since. She said the company had looked into it years ago, quietly, and stopped looking into it once they realized that every driver who'd reported it kept driving that route anyway, weight or no weight, because the delivery bonus for that circuit was too good to turn down. I still run that circuit. I still feel the weight on those 2 grades every single time, right on schedule, gone by the time I clear Widow's Grade completely. I've stopped checking my trailer doors. I already know what I'll find. I've driven solo for most of my career, which is exactly why I remember every detail of the one night I wasn't alone on the road, even though every record says I was. My name's Priya Malhotra, and I hauled long-haul freight through the Appalachian corridor for 6 years before I switched to regional routes, closer to home. This story is from my last long-haul winter hauling auto parts on a route that took me through a mountain stretch known for bad weather and worse cell coverage. The kind of road where you learn to trust your headlights because nothing else out there is going to help you. It was snowing hard that night, heavy enough that I'd slowed to a crawl, hazards on, following the taillights of a truck ahead of me because in weather like that, you follow whoever's already found the road. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour before those taillights appeared, and I remember feeling genuinely relieved, the kind of relief that comes from not being completely alone on a mountain in a whiteout. We drove like that for almost 20 minutes, my truck tucked in behind his, both of us crawling through snow that made the guardrails nothing but suggestion. Then a third set of taillights appeared in my mirror, another truck falling in behind me, and I remember thinking that was strange. 3 of us finding each other on a night like this, but strange in a comforting way. Safety in numbers, even out here. We held that formation for another 15 minutes before the truck ahead of me signaled and pulled off at an exit I didn't recognize, one that wasn't on my route sheet or my GPS. Just a gap in the guardrail with a ramp curving up into the snow. I watched his tail lights disappear up that ramp and felt a flicker of unease I couldn't explain. Some part of me wanting to follow him instead of continuing alone. I didn't follow him. I kept going, and a few minutes later I realized the truck behind me had also fallen away, its lights gone from my mirror without me ever seeing it exit. I was alone again. Snow still falling hard, and something about the sudden solitude felt heavier than it should have. When I finally reached the depot and filed my run report, I mentioned the 2 other trucks almost casually, expecting my dispatcher to note it and move on. Instead, he asked me for their carrier markings, standard information for any documented convoy on a state route in bad weather. I realized, describing them back to myself, that I'd never actually seen any markings. No company name, no DOT number, no identifying features at all. Just taillights and shape, blurred by snow, filled in by my own assumption that they were ordinary rigs like mine. He pulled the route cameras for that stretch, the automated ones mounted at intervals along the highway for weather monitoring, and told me something that stayed with me every winter since. The cameras showed my truck alone on that road, the entire 20 minutes. No other vehicles in frame at any point along that stretch. I asked him about the exit ramp, the one I'd watched a truck disappear up. He checked the route maps while I waited on the line and told me there was no exit at that location. Never had been. Just an unbroken stretch of guardrail the whole way through that section of mountain. I don't know what I was following that night or what was following me. I've driven that stretch in snow a dozen times since, always alone, always watching my mirrors a little too carefully, hoping I won't see a second set of lights, and half hoping I will, just so I'll finally understand what I saw.